So Jimmy Goodwin told me a story. Back in 1934, he spent the night there used to be a stone hut on top of Mount Marcy. And so in 1934, he skied up Mount Marcy on Christmas Eve. And he said he remembers going out in like 20 below zero to see the stars or see the lights in Lake Placid and from the top of Mount Marcy, and then they skied down the next day. That hut is no longer there. As far as forest preserve goes, you can't have a stone hut on top of a mountain. Jimmy Goodwin was a guide from the time he was 16, and he was a quintessent mountaineer skier. He climbed the trap dike for the first time in 1935 with Ralph Stanley. The first winter ascent of the trap dike. It was huge. They used ice axes and crampons. No one was using that then. He skied for Williams College. And when he graduated, he was in Keene Valley already as a guide in the summer. And so from a mountaineering standpoint and a guiding standpoint, he was huge. And he was a great skier. The thing I liked about Jimmy the most was he was so humble. When I would see him, he would be like, well, we could never do what you guys do today on skis. And I'd be like, no, Jimmy, you were on these huge wooden planks with leather bindings. And you skied Tuckerman's Ravine. And you skied all these peaks, not all of them, but a lot of them. I said, you were amazing. And he always would deflect it back to you. He said, oh no, what you guys are doing now, I could never do that. And of course the equipment is so much different. And Jimmy was an incredible mountaineer. Jimmy Goodwin skied Marcy for the first time in the winter of 1929, 1930. And he was in Lake Placid. He was skiing for Williams College. He was a captain of the ski team. He decided he wanted to ski Mount Marcy before he left. So he went into Marcy Dam, he camped overnight. He left it very early in the morning. He actually tied quarter-inch twine to the bottom of his skis in half hitches because he didn't have climbing skins. And he used that to climb up to the old stone hut on top of Mount Marcy. And when he got to the stone hut, there actually were 4 other skiers in the hut who had come up the day before. Jimmy, had some tea with them and then turned around and skied back down. And that was his first time skiing Mount Marcy, was 1920 and 1930. Remember meeting them up in the shelter?
Oh, sure. Yeah, remember.
What was the shelter like?
It had 2 layers of bunks, and 2 people could sleep in each bunk, so 4, and that was just half of the building. The other half of the building also had the same thing, so it could accommodate 8 people altogether. And but it was a stone hut, divided more or less likely. I guess they gotten the idea from the Appies and the White Mountains and so on. We used it, and a number of people enjoyed the experience of it until World War II came along. And I got back from World War II, and the place was a mess, torn the woodwork and all that sort of thing out because they wanted fuel to keep the place warm, and that seemed to be a source of fuel anyway. And
what was the ski trail like back then, Jimmy? Do you remember what the trail was like, how wide it was, or what it was like skiing that trail? Was it steep? Was it not so steep? Or?
Well, it was pretty much the way it is today, but narrow, and it was nothing, just a walking trail, as far as that goes. And the big thing was just to know how to snowplow, and when you got into a real mess, to make Christie stop and so on. But I remember it worked out pretty well, easily. I had done enough skiing in those days, so I was able to handle it all right.
What about the time you spent Christmas Eve up there on top of Mount Marcy? You skied in 1934.
Yeah.
You spent Christmas Eve with Bob Notman
Yeah.
in that hut. And you guys skied, I guess, top to bottom on Marcy.
We climbed by the Orthodox route that's used even today up there, but eventually when we went back was by the lumber roads. They had lumbered as high up as
Indian Falls?
there wasn't, I guess it's Indian Falls, yes, that's right. No, that was the top of a waterfall.
Probably Indian Falls.
Yeah, Indian Falls.
Yeah, there was a big lumber camp there, right?
Yeah, there had been, and there still were the remains of that at that time, where the lean-to has been built since.
So you were skiing the lumber roads.
Yes.
What was that?
But well, that was a lot easier than I came up by the walking trail, but then skied down that lumber road from there, and I remember it started right down the brook, and beyond that it wasn't difficult at all to ski. I remember, of course, I was breaking trail, the only person, and so on. But because it had been a lumber road, it was a reasonably well graded, wide trail.
What was it like in the hut that night? Do you remember spending Christmas Eve with Bob Notman?
Yeah.
And breaking out into the stars? You wrote it was negative 30 degrees. And then the next morning there was like looking over a big sea of clouds with haystacks sticking out. Like
that's right.
Across to it.
And through the dicks and all that, the islands in the clouds lower than the mountain tops, so on. What an experience you always remember. But we had good sleeping bags, so we didn't suffer from, once we were in the bag, I remember getting out of the bags and taking that view of Lake Placid and that sort of thing. We could only stand it for a couple of looks as far as that goes. And I remember also was that, I guess I mentioned in my description about it, the fact that looking east you could see dicks in the mountains that going up through the clouds. The clouds were lower than on Marcy and all the way through the dicks. And you could see these islands sticking up in the ocean of the clouds and so on.
Developed by Otto Schniebs, and you skied that in 1940. In your book, you said that you skied Mount Marcy one day, and then the next day you went up and skied the pretty new Wright Peak ski trail.
That's right.
What was that trail like? Was it a nice trail? Was it?
Oh yeah, it had been recently cut into. Hal Burton was the driving force anyway, and got various other people interested. And it was narrow by modern ideas of what a ski trail should be, but it was a lot wider than an ordinary lumber road or anything like that. And its grade was so good that even intermediate skiers skied it, enjoyed it, and so on. And it came down to the flat place on that ridge, and then came down to where the hiking trail was. I don't know what's the hiking trail still or joins it now, and or
no, it's actually much lower now. It used to be where the hiking trail came up by McIntyre Falls, but now they've abandoned that part from McIntyre Falls to the lodge.
Oh, sure.
And now all the hikers and skiers share one trail, which is the ski trail.
I see.
So was it a fun trail? Did a lot of people ski the Wright Peak ski trail back then? Or?
Yeah, right up. I remember it was chiefly before World War II. After World War II, well, it had grown up somewhat, and So it finally was not very skiable. And they'll finally by fighting the group that tried to prevent it, Hal Burton doing most of the fighting, because he was good at that sort of thing. We cut the trail again, more or less just cutting it again after the war. And I guess it's skiable now, isn't it?
Yeah, it's still skiable. It's a great ski trail.
Oh, yeah.
So there were a lot of people skiing it, though, before the war and after the war. Did you ever see other people skiing up there when you were there?
Oh, yeah. Oh, sure. Oh, right after we'd constructed it, so a lot of people got wise. The Placid Club people had been interested in it, that we were doing this, and they advertised it in their, in the club rooms and all that sort of thing about great skiing on Wright's Peak, and so the trail was used right at the beginning, pretty much, and when it was recut again, it became somewhat popular. But by then, there were better trails elsewhere. Never got the volunteers together to widen it out as the way it should have been. Though I think there were always also problems with the state. They weren't sure that they wanted it widened and all that sort of thing. Various groups. There was a group that was completely against ski trails anyway, that fought it and was successful in keeping it from being widened the way it should have been. Apparently the Adirondack people had a lot more resistance from various groups and so on against any ski trails at all. They tried to prevent anything being constructed. Well, they just didn't think people should be up there skiing. And the fact that in order to make a better a ski trail that was a little better than the walking trail, at least, it involved cutting trees. And that was very bad, of course, and well, was from one point of view. And their whole argument, even the Lake Placid Club crowd were all for it. They wanted a decent ski trail in those places. But they were the only organization then that were really involved in decent skiing and so on. They had professionals whom they hired and so on, who taught modern skiing as it was developed at that time anyway.
No, the Adirondack Mountain Club, or the Lake Placid Club owned the Adirondack Lodge, I think. Yeah. Didn't they teach skiing there?
Yes.
And they had a ski slope, and they had a slope on Mount Joe?
That's right, yeah. Yeah, they built that slope on Mount Joe.
And that was the Adirondack Mountain Club.
Yeah.
And I think in 1936, the Adirondack Mountain Club got permission to widen the Marcy Trail, to cut what's now the ski trail. Did you ever ski that afterwards? I guess when you skied it in 1940, it must have been wider. Maybe because of the work of the Adirondack Mountain Club.
I think it probably was. Lake Placid Club, in order to get the girls to come from New York City and all that stuff, thought it was great because they'd organized this college competition between all the colleges. There were at least 2 Canadian colleges that joined, and of course they had Dartmouth and Williams and New Hampshire always used to send a bunch of good skiers. In fact, they very often won the meets, even beating the Canadian people. because they were active in this competition and their newspaper accounts of what was going on the sport page and all that sort of thing, made big stuff. And you'd lure a number of people to the Adirondacks, and particularly the girls to the Lake Placid Club, because the rugged skiers were up there. As far as that goes, they knew they were nice skiers, colleges and so on. It wasn't bad otherwise.
Did you ever take any trips into the mountains when you came up for those meets, or?
Yeah, with groups, I did. Well, I didn't many times, but I did climb Marcy that first time. First year that we got finished the skiing at Lake Placid and so on, and then each time I would climb some. I remember skiing Whiteface, and incidentally climbed Whiteface all the way to the top, and you know the place where the road cuts through, start with, is very narrow. There's a single track, obviously, and so on. Well, that was solid on the top. In other words, building the road, they'd cut that out and made an open road out of it rather than a tunnel. But what I'm trying to suggest is that I skied all the way down Whiteface. The trail that I used was just a hiking trail from what is the other side of the mountain. I've forgotten what the towns are called over there now. But there were lumber roads that came fairly high up on Whiteface at that time, and the trail went to that area, got down to those lumber roads, and then at a certain level, when you're really off the steep part of the mountain, there was a nice lumber road that went right across to the what was the beginning of the trail today, these days, at the level of the pass above Wilmington.
Did you ski with anyone else that day?
No, I was alone.
Alone skiing Marcy?
Yeah.
And alone skiing Whiteface?
Yeah. Broke all the rules, there's no question about it.